The encounter was a typical evening at the upscale restaurant in downtown, a place that attracted the city's elite and those who could afford a taste of luxury. The chandeliers above sparkled, casting soft golden light over the elegant marble floors and polished wooden tables. The waitstaff moved like clockwork, expertly weaving between tables with trays of food and wine glasses, creating an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. It was the kind of place where a man's wealth was often silently measured by the crispness of his suit, the elegance of his posture, and the discreet way he ordered. But one person was about to break that unspoken code. Big Shaq had entered the restaurant quietly, unnoticed by most at first. He was dressed simply, wearing a black jacket, a t-shirt, and dark jeans, a stark contrast to the well-dressed crowd around him. Despite his massive presence, he managed to blend in, perhaps because he didn't draw attention in the usual ways. His demeanor was calm, collected, almost deliberately unremarkable. He wasn't there for flashy displays or to be seen. He was there to enjoy a peaceful meal, something he didn't get to do often with his hectic schedule. Little did he know, his quiet evening was about to be disrupted by someone who didn't know who he was. The waiter, a young man named Chris, was tasked with greeting the newest arrival. He was relatively new to the job, still learning the ropes, eager to impress with his sharp uniform and even sharper wit. He approached Shaq's table with a smile, ready to offer the usual pleasantries. However, from the moment Chris laid eyes on the man, his brain made a quick assumption, one that would soon prove to be a monumental mistake. Chris saw a man who looked like he belonged to the common folk, a man who might be there for a quick casual meal without the knowledge of the finer things. He didn't look like someone who could afford the restaurant's most expensive dishes. He certainly didn't look like the kind of person who would be a regular at places like this. In his mind, he had already pegged Shaq as just another guy trying to fit in with the elite, the kind of person who probably felt uncomfortable surrounded by such wealth. And that, in Chris's mind, gave him a certain power, a power he was eager to wield. As he pulled out the chair across from Shaq and introduced himself, his words were coated with a smugness, an underlying tone of superiority that was clearly aimed at establishing his dominance over the situation. "Good evening, sir," Chris said, with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What can I get for you tonight? Perhaps a nice wine to start. We have a fine selection of reds, the kind of wine you'll find only in the finest establishments. You know." Shaq looked up from the menu, his calm eyes meeting Chris's for a brief moment before returning to the food options in front of him. He could sense the tone, the slight condescension in the waiter's voice, but he said nothing. He didn't want to cause a scene. "Not tonight," Chris continued, talking about the wines, his voice never faltering. "We also have a wonderful selection of appetizers. Our lobster bisque is famous if you're looking for something classic." He leaned in slightly, perhaps a bit too much, and added, "But I'd suggest you steer clear of anything too exotic. Some of our more refined guests don't care for things like, well, things that might be too much for someone like you to handle." Shaq paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he kept his response to himself. He wasn't here for confrontation. He wasn't here to fight. He just wanted a meal. Chris, still unaware of the storm he was stirring, continued with a list of recommended dishes, all with the same undertone of superiority. He made casual jabs at Shaq's choices, offering a knowing smile whenever Shaq hesitated. "I think you'll enjoy the grilled salmon. It's a safe choice, something everyone loves. But the risotto, well, it's a bit more sophisticated, you know? A bit too fancy for some, but I think you'd be able to appreciate it." Shaq finally raised his eyes to meet Chris's. "I'll have the risotto," he said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the irritation he felt at being belittled. He wasn't looking for trouble, but it was clear to anyone paying attention that the waiter's attitude was pushing him closer to the edge. "Excellent choice," Chris said, clearly pleased with himself, as if he had just helped a lost soul find the right path. He scribbled something on his notepad almost arrogantly. "I'll bring that right out. And perhaps a wine pairing for you, sir?" Shaq nodded, but his patience was starting to wear thin. Chris turned to leave but paused as if something just occurred to him. "Oh, and I'd recommend you try the bread," he added, without turning around. It's a bit of a delicacy around here. I'm sure you'll appreciate it. It's quite simple but delicious. Nothing too out of your comfort zone." Shaq's grip tightened ever so slightly on the edge of the table, but he still didn't speak. His hand moved to the menu, tracing the edges of the pages without really looking at them, lost in thought. He wasn't going to react to the taunts, but the waiter's behavior had planted a seed of discomfort that Shaq couldn't ignore. He took a deep breath, trying to let go of the tension, but his mind already knew that this wasn't going to end well for Chris. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, and Big Shaq wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. Meanwhile, Chris walked back toward the kitchen, his smug expression still lingering, unaware of the man sitting behind him. He didn't know that the man he had just mocked and belittled was not just some random diner. He didn't know that Big Shaq wasn't just a man sitting down for a meal. He didn't know that Shaq was the owner of the very restaurant he worked for. The insult Chris returned to the kitchen, his thoughts filled with a sense of smugness that came with believing he had control of the situation. He had made it clear that he was the one in charge. The way he had spoken to Shaq, his words laced with mockery, his tone dripping with condescension, all while assuming that the man would never dare question him. It felt like a victory. To Chris, it was an amusing game. He was in a place where the wealthy dined, and he was part of that world, even if just as an employee. In his mind, those who came into the restaurant were nothing more than patrons to be served, to be ordered about with a sense of superiority. As he passed by the kitchen staff, Chris offered a quick glance and a slight chuckle, as though he had just pulled off some grand joke. He had been waiting for this moment, the feeling of power that came from putting someone in their place. He could already imagine the other waiters laughing about the easy mark he had just dealt with. No one had questioned him, at least not yet. Back at the table, Shaq was left alone with his thoughts. He had been insulted in subtle ways, each comment seemingly small, but each one building like layers of a storm cloud. The waiter's arrogance, the underestimation of his status, and the casual dismissal of his preferences. It was all building up in Shaq's mind. But still, he didn't speak up. He wasn't here to teach a lesson to some young waiter who thought he knew better. It was just a meal. He was here to enjoy his evening in peace, not to become part of some drama that would inevitably unfold. But as he sat there waiting for his meal, there was something that gnawed at him, something deeper than the inconvenience of a disrespectful server. Shaq's reputation was built on his business acumen, his success, and his power in the industry. He had risen from humble beginnings to become one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the city. He had invested in countless ventures, always with an eye for spotting potential in places others overlooked. He had no need to flaunt his wealth, to wear it on his sleeve or throw it in people's faces. It was something he had built through years of hard work, sacrifice, and strategic thinking. So when a young man with no idea who he was made assumptions based on his appearance, it stung in a way Shaq wasn't used to. The waiter, on the other hand, was basking in his moment of victory, unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. Chris found his way back to the bar, where the other waitstaff were gathered, laughing about the latest interactions with the customers. Chris joined in with the banter, boasting about how he had taught the guy a lesson. He was proud of himself, full of the kind of false confidence that often comes with ignorance. "It's crazy, right?" Chris said, leaning against the counter. "He came in here looking all clueless, and I knew right away he was just another rich guy pretending to know how to act around people like us. I gave him the full experience. Told him to stick with the basics. I mean, the risotto was definitely a safe choice for him, right?" The other waiters chuckled, nodding in agreement. No one could have known what Shaq really was. No one could have known that the man they were so casually mocking was the owner of the entire restaurant. Chris's voice grew louder the more he talked. He felt invincible, untouchable in the moment. And you should have seen his face when I offered him the bread. I don't think he knew what he was in for. He probably thought it was some kind of fancy delicacy, something he'd never tasted before. A few more laughs followed, but the manager, who had overheard part of the conversation, didn't find it amusing. His eyes narrowed, and he approached the group with a calm, measured pace. "Chris," the manager said, his voice steady but carrying an underlying edge. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Chris, feeling the sudden shift in the air, turned to face the manager. He quickly wiped the smug expression off his face, masking it with a more neutral one. "Sure, no problem," he said, a little too casually. The manager gestured for Chris to follow him. They moved to a quieter area of the restaurant, away from the others. Chris felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure why the manager wanted to talk to him, He had done everything right in his mind, but the unease grew with every step. Once they were out of earshot of the other staff, the manager stopped and faced Chris. "You've been disrespectful to a customer," the manager began, his tone colder than Chris had ever heard before. "A very important customer, I might add. You have no idea who you were dealing with." Chris blinked, his face falling as he tried to process the words. "What are you talking about? It's just some rich guy, right?" "I mean, we get people like that all the time. He's not special." The manager sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, clearly frustrated. "Chris, that rich guy is the owner of this restaurant. You just insulted the person who runs this place." The words hit Chris like a punch to the gut. He felt his world suddenly shift, the floor beneath him feeling less stable. His face turned pale as the realization began to sink in. The man he had mocked, the one he had dismissed with such arrogance, was not just any diner. He was the one who owned everything Chris had ever known in this restaurant. The weight of his mistake began to press down on him, suffocating him with the knowledge of what he had done. Chris stammered, but the manager didn't give him a chance to finish. "Do you think you can just treat people like that?" the manager asked, his voice rising. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. And now, because of your actions, you've put all of us in a very difficult position." Chris's mind was racing. He tried to think of an excuse, a way out, but the words caught in his throat. He could only stand there, stunned by the reality of his own actions. The manager shook his head in disbelief. "I'll let him handle it from here. But know this, if you ever treat a customer like that again, especially someone like him, you won't have a job here anymore." Chris felt the sting of the warning, but it wasn't the job he was worried about now. It was the humiliation that was about to come crashing down on him. The truth was out. He had no idea who Shaq was, and now he was about to face the consequences of that ignorance. As Chris walked back to the front of the restaurant, the weight of the situation grew heavier. His thoughts were consumed with the image of the man he had insulted. He wondered if Shaq had even noticed how deeply he had been offended, or if he had just let it go, hoping to avoid any conflict. But one thing was clear. He was about to find out just how much power a person could wield when they were underestimated. The moment of truth. The restaurant was buzzing with its usual energy as patrons dined, unaware of the drama unfolding in the background. The soft clinking of glasses, the hum of quiet conversations, and the gentle rustling of napkins as the staff moved swiftly around the room continued uninterrupted. Yet in the kitchen and in the back corridors, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Chris had returned to the front of the restaurant, his face still pale and his mind racing. His thoughts were a whirlwind of disbelief and shame, each passing moment feeling heavier than the last. He tried to go through the motions, filling drink orders, delivering plates of food, but nothing felt right. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made his every move feel calculated and forced. He couldn't shake the feeling of the manager's words echoing in his mind. The realization that the man he had insulted wasn't just another diner. It was the owner of the entire restaurant. For a moment, Chris wondered if there was any chance of fixing things. Could he go to Shaq, apologize, try to make amends? He didn't know if that would even make a difference. But the thought of facing the man who could change his life with just a word sent a chill down his spine. He tried to focus, to continue with his duties, but his mind kept returning to that one table. The image of Shaq sitting there, calm and composed, waiting for his meal. While Chris had made joke after joke at his expense, it was like a bad dream that wouldn't let go. Shaq, for his part, remained entirely unfazed by the scene in the restaurant. He had been enjoying his meal, the quiet hum of the evening giving him the space he needed to clear his mind. His thoughts were on other matters, his business dealings, investments, plans for the future. He didn't come to the restaurant for drama or confrontation. He just wanted a simple, peaceful night. But beneath the surface, something told him that the evening wasn't going to stay quiet for long. He had felt it from the moment Chris had served him, the undertone in the waiter's voice, the condescension that had been thinly veiled behind a smile. It wasn't something Shaq was unused to. He had dealt with arrogant people before, but this time it felt different. As Shaq finished his meal, his mind was made up. He wasn't going to let this one slide. Not because he couldn't take the insults, they were insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but because it was important to teach respect. In his world, respect wasn't just something you earned from others. It was something you gave, something you showed, and something you demanded in return. And this waiter, Chris, had shown none of it. The tension in the restaurant had shifted. Word had spread quietly at first, but quickly enough, that the man who had been disrespected wasn't just some anonymous diner. The whispers started at the bar, where the staff had gathered after their shifts, and it didn't take long for the truth to reach the other employees. Big Shaq, the owner of the restaurant, the man who had created this establishment from the ground up, had been the target of Chris's thoughtless arrogance. The news spread through the kitchen, the waitstaff, and even the security team. Each person who learned the truth carried the same mix of shock, disbelief, and concern. They all knew the consequences of disrespecting a person of Shaq's stature. He was a man who didn't tolerate fools lightly. Back in the dining room, Chris was still trying to navigate his duties, but it felt like he was walking in slow motion, every step heavier than the last. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that Shaq had finished his meal. He was no longer just another faceless customer. He was the owner, and Chris had insulted him. The minutes dragged on until finally the restaurant manager approached Chris once more. His face was grim, his eyes serious. "Chris, I need you to go to the front office," the manager said quietly. "Shaq wants to speak with you." Chris's heart sank. He stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the words crushing him. The walk to the office felt like it took an eternity. Each step felt like he was walking toward his fate, the inevitable consequence of his actions. He had no idea what to expect. Would Shaq be furious? Would he fire him on the spot? Would there be consequences far worse than just losing his job? When Chris finally reached the office door, he hesitated before knocking. His mind raced through every possible outcome, none of them good. He took a deep breath and knocked gently. "Come in," a calm voice called from the other side. Chris opened the door and stepped inside, his hands trembling slightly as he shut it behind him. Shaq sat behind a large wooden desk, the kind of desk that commanded respect. It was solid, no nonsense, just like its owner. Shaq didn't stand to greet him, but his presence was larger than life, filling the room even in silence. Chris could feel the power in the room, the same power that had built this place from the ground up. The reality of the situation hit him full force, and he found himself struggling to keep his composure. Shaq looked up from his desk, his eyes locking with Chris's. There was no anger in his gaze, just a calm, calculating look that seemed to cut right through Chris's thin facade of bravado. Shaq didn't need to say anything at first. The silence stretched out heavy with anticipation. Chris could feel the weight of his own mistakes pressing down on him. Shaq finally broke the silence. "Chris," he said, his voice steady and controlled, "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm not here to embarrass you, but I am here to teach you something important." Chris nodded, his throat dry, unable to speak. He wanted to apologize, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. Shaq continued, "What you did tonight was disrespectful, not just to me, but to the job you're doing. You're here to serve people, to treat them with respect no matter who they are. You think I'm just some guy who doesn't belong in a place like this, but the truth is you have no idea who you're dealing with, and that ignorance, it has consequences." Chris's mind raced as Shaq spoke. He knew he had messed up, but hearing the man's calm words, the weight behind them, made it clear just how much he had underestimated the situation. "I don't care about the jokes you made at my expense," Shaq went on. "What matters is that you learned the lesson. Respect isn't something you get to choose when you give it. It should be given freely to everyone, no matter their status. And when you're in a place like this, you represent not just yourself, but everyone who works here. You think your actions don't matter? They do." Chris felt a knot form in his stomach. The words hit him harder than anything else could. He had disrespected someone who didn't need to show off his wealth or position, someone who was above the petty games Chris had played. And now the lesson was about to be learned. Shaq paused for a moment, studying Chris's face. The silence stretched again, and this time Chris couldn't hold back any longer. He finally spoke, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean to—" Shaq held up a hand, cutting him off. "I know you didn't, but that's the problem, Chris. You don't know who anyone is. And that's where you've gone wrong. It's not just about knowing someone's name or their wealth. It's about treating everyone with dignity. You're not here to judge. You're here to serve." Chris nodded again, this time with more understanding. The realization of his mistake had finally settled in. Shaq's calm, composed words had struck deeper than any harsh reprimand could have. This wasn't about power, it was about respect, and Chris had a long way to go to earn it back. The reveal Chris's heart pounded as he stood there, the weight of Shaq's words still hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Shaq didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten him, yet the quiet authority in his tone made everything else seem irrelevant. Chris had never felt so small, so insignificant. Every arrogant thought he had about himself, every assumption he had made about the world, about the people who walked into that restaurant, shattered in that one moment. He stood there in silence, unsure of what to say or how to react. He was a man suddenly out of his depth, caught in the undeniable reality that he had crossed a line he should never have crossed. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on Chris, assessing him as if waiting for him to absorb everything that had been said. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the kind of silence that spoke volumes without a single word. Chris's mind raced, scrambling for something to say, something to make this situation right. But all he could do was stand there, struggling to find his voice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Shaq broke the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet authority that made Chris's stomach churn. "I'm not angry with you, Chris, but what you need to understand is that respect is something that should be earned by how you treat people, not by how you perceive them at first glance. You've assumed things about me, about my life, based on nothing but appearances. You thought I was just some guy, someone who couldn't possibly be part of this world, someone who didn't belong in a restaurant like this, and that's your mistake." Chris nodded slowly, his throat tight, unsure of how to respond. He had thought he was being clever, that he was above it all, but now, faced with the reality of who Shaq was, he realized how foolish he had been. The words he had thrown around so casually, mocking Shaq's appearance, dismissing him as just another diner, now seemed ridiculous. Shaq wasn't just another diner. He wasn't just another wealthy man sitting in the restaurant. He was the reason the restaurant existed in the first place, the reason Chris even had a job here. And yet Chris had treated him as though he were beneath him. "I don't know who you think you are," Shaq continued, his voice still even, still unwavering. "But this restaurant, the business we've built here, it wasn't built on arrogance. It wasn't built on people thinking they know more than they do. It was built on respect, on understanding the value of hard work and humility. And you, Chris, you've forgotten that. You've let your ego cloud your judgment, and that's not something I take lightly." Chris swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. He felt like he was suffocating in that room, the air thick with the weight of his own regret. But Shaq wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he spoke, and this time, there was a hint of something more, something deeper, beneath his calm exterior. "I didn't tell you who I was earlier, Chris, and that was intentional," Shaq said, his voice low and controlled. "I wanted to see what kind of person you were. I wanted to see how you treated people when you thought there were no consequences. You thought you could get away with insulting someone just because they didn't fit your idea of what a rich person should look like. You thought you could make fun of me because I didn't wear an expensive suit or because I didn't order a steak as a statement." He paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. "The truth is, you didn't know who I was. And that, Chris, is what makes your actions so much worse. You disrespected someone who has built something out of nothing, someone who could have been your mentor, your inspiration, but you didn't even take the time to find out." Chris felt his knees weaken as the full force of Shaq's words hit him. He had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume that someone who didn't look the part was somehow lesser. He had insulted a man who was more successful, more intelligent, and more accomplished than he could ever hope to be. He couldn't even imagine the kind of discipline, the kind of work it must have taken for Shaq to reach the position he was in now. And yet there he was, standing in front of him, making assumptions based on nothing but surface-level impressions. "Do you know who I am now?" Shaq asked, his voice a little softer, but still holding a sense of authority that Chris couldn't ignore. Chris opened his mouth to speak, but found that he had no words. His mind was spinning, trying to catch up with the revelation that had just been dropped on him. Shaq didn't need to explain further. He knew the truth had already sunk in. But Chris needed to hear it. He needed to understand exactly how deep his mistake ran. Shaq stood up from his desk, and for the first time in their conversation, he moved around to the front, facing Chris. "I am the owner of this restaurant," Shaq said, his voice steady but filled with a weight that pressed down on Chris's chest. "I'm the one who took the risks. who invested the time and energy to make this place what it is today. I'm the one who built it from the ground up, and this restaurant isn't just a business for me. It's a reflection of my values, my work ethic, and the people who contribute to its success. People like you." The words stung. They cut deep. Chris felt a rush of heat in his chest as the reality of the situation sank in. He had been looking at Shaq all night as though he were just another customer, someone who didn't deserve the kind of service he was getting. But now Chris was faced with the truth. Shaq wasn't just a customer. He was the one who had given Chris the opportunity to work here in the first place. Shaq was the reason he had a job, the reason he had a paycheck to depend on, and now Chris had crossed a line he couldn't take back. "You've made a fool of yourself, Chris," Shaq said, his tone shifting slightly. There was no anger in his voice, but there was a sense of finality, a sense that the time for explanations was over. "You don't just disrespect the customers here. You disrespect the work that's been done to build this place, and you disrespect the people who make it run. You've shown me who you really are, and I'm not impressed." Chris stood there stunned, his face burning with embarrassment. He had never felt so small, so unimportant. He had spent his life trying to make something of himself, trying to prove that he was worthy of respect. But in that moment, standing in front of Shaq, he realized just how far he still had to go. Shaq's gaze softened slightly, but there was still a sternness to it, something that reminded Chris that this was no time for excuses. "I'm not going to fire you," Shaq said, his voice calm once again. "But I am going to make sure you understand what it means to earn respect. You're going to work with me, and you're going to learn how to treat people. You're going to learn what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. And if you don't, then you can find another job." Chris nodded, his throat tight. He had no other choice but to accept the reality that Shaq was offering him. It wasn't the punishment he had expected, but it was worse in its own way. To work alongside someone like Shaq, to be reminded of his mistakes every day, would be a challenge unlike any other. But Chris knew he had no right to complain. He had brought this on himself, and now he had to face the consequences of his own arrogance. The lesson. The days following Chris's conversation with Shaq were a blur. His routine in the restaurant altered completely. The weight of what had happened continued to linger over him, each moment serving as a reminder of how deeply he had misjudged the situation, how far from the man he thought he was. He had come to this restaurant thinking he was in control, thinking he could manipulate the situation with his charm and arrogance. But in just a few hours he had lost everything. Or so he thought. Shaq's words echoed in his mind constantly, the reality of his position, of what he had done, pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had been given a chance, a rare opportunity to learn from someone who had built something substantial, someone who had the wisdom of years of experience, years of struggle. He had never felt so small, so unworthy, and yet that was exactly what he needed to feel. It was a humbling experience, one that threatened to break him at first, but ultimately, one that would teach him more than he could have ever imagined. The first day after his talk with Shaq felt like walking through a fog. He moved mechanically, taking orders, delivering food, doing everything by rote. He couldn't focus on anything else. The other waiters, who had once been his companions in arrogance, treated him with a new kind of distance, unsure of what to make of him now. There was a kind of pity in their eyes mixed with something else, a quiet judgment. They had heard the rumors, the whispers about what had happened between Chris and Shaq. They knew he had messed up, and they knew there was no coming back from a mistake like that. But at the same time, they also saw the shift in him. They saw how he was carrying himself now, how his shoulders were a little more hunched, how his movements were slower, more deliberate. It was a strange feeling, knowing that the people who had once looked at him with admiration, if not envy, now saw him differently. The tables had turned, and it was no longer Chris who had the upper hand. He had no one to blame but himself. But what he didn't know was that this was only the beginning of his transformation. Shaq, for his part, continued to watch from the sidelines. He didn't immediately change the dynamic of the restaurant, nor did he offer Chris any special treatment. In fact, he continued to watch him as if he were just another employee, observing from afar, waiting to see if the lesson had truly been learned. Shaq wasn't a man who needed to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to rub his success in anyone's face. He had built his empire not on bravado or flashiness, but on a deep understanding of human nature, of the way people behaved when they thought no one was watching. And now it was Chris's turn to learn that lesson. Shaq's approach was subtle. He didn't sit down with Chris and give him lectures every day, nor did he go out of his way to correct every mistake. Instead, he allowed Chris to make those mistakes, to learn from them, to experience the consequences of his actions firsthand. He would watch as Chris struggled with orders, as he tried to make small talk with the customers, as he fumbled through conversations that once would have been effortless. And Shaq did nothing to interfere, but there were moments when Shaq's quiet presence would make itself known. One evening, Chris was struggling with a difficult customer, a wealthy woman who was demanding and impatient, the kind of customer who believed the world revolved around her. Chris tried his best to cater to her every whim, but she was impossible to please. She snapped at him for the slightest mistake, berating him in front of the entire dining room. It was the kind of situation that would have sent Chris into a defensive, sarcastic mode in the past, the kind of situation where he would have fought back, played the victim, or brushed it off with a joke. But that day, as he stood there trying to keep his composure, he remembered Shaq's words. Respect isn't something you choose to give. It's something you give to everyone, no matter who they are or what they look like. He stood there listening to the woman's complaints, taking them without responding in kind. He smiled politely, apologized, and made sure her requests were handled. He didn't fight back, didn't lash out in frustration, and when he returned to the kitchen to grab her dessert, he saw Shaq watching him from across the room, nodding ever so slightly. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough for Chris to realize that he had done something right. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. For the first time in days, Chris felt something like hope, the kind of hope that had been buried deep inside him ever since Shaq had called him out on his behavior. That night, when he walked out of the restaurant, he didn't feel as though the world was closing in on him. Instead, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand something more important than anything he had learned in the past. Shaq had watched it all from the sidelines, his sharp eyes taking in the smallest of details. He could see the change in Chris, the way he no longer acted out of arrogance, no longer assumed he was better than others just because of his job. He had started to take responsibility for his actions, to think before speaking, to treat people with respect, not because of their status, but because it was the right thing to do. Shaq didn't need to see a complete transformation overnight. He just needed to see the seeds of growth, the willingness to change, and he was seeing it in Chris, but Shaq wasn't going to make it easy. There would be no grand gesture of forgiveness, no easy way out. Chris would have to prove himself day by day through small acts of kindness, patience, and humility. He would have to earn the trust of the people around him, the trust he had once taken for granted, and that process would be slow. It wouldn't happen overnight. But Shaq knew that the most important lessons were the hardest to learn, and the ones that took the longest to absorb were the ones that would stick with him the most. Weeks went by, and Chris found himself growing little by little. He began to understand the people around him in ways he hadn't before. He learned that customers weren't just there to be served. They were people with their own struggles, their own stories, and it was his job to meet them with empathy and care. He learned that respect wasn't just about being polite. It was about listening, about understanding, about seeing people for who they truly were. And in doing so, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride in his work. Shaq continued to observe, never offering praise, never offering criticism. He was letting Chris walk the path of change on his own, letting him make mistakes and learn from them. But Shaq's quiet approval was always there, in the way he nodded when Chris handled a difficult customer with grace, in the way he watched him interact with the rest of the staff, making an effort to be more inclusive, more understanding. Shaq didn't need to say anything. The change in Chris was clear, and that was enough. In time, Chris began to see the world differently. He began to understand that there was so much more to success than just the outward trappings, the clothes, the wealth, the power. Success was about the people you respected and the relationships you built. It was about the small moments, the quiet victories, and the way you treated others when no one was watching. And as he learned these lessons, he started to become the man Shaq had always known he could be. The lesson as the weeks passed, Chris settled into a routine that felt increasingly like a redemption arc, a journey that was as much about self-discovery as it was about the responsibilities of his job. The arrogance that had once defined him seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a new humility, an awareness of how easily he had taken things for granted. His days at the restaurant had become a reflection of the work he had to do on himself, a constant reminder of his earlier mistakes and the long road ahead to rectify them. What struck him most was how the change wasn't immediate, how it came slowly, without fanfare. Each interaction, each day felt like another brick laid in the foundation of the person he was becoming. Shaq, for his part, was still the quiet observer. He continued to stay largely in the background, allowing Chris to handle the ups and downs of the restaurant's daily rhythm. He never forced the issue, never came down with hard words or overt guidance. The few times their paths did cross in the restaurant, Shaq's presence was always a quiet, steadying force. He never seemed to need validation from anyone, and that in itself was a lesson Chris was starting to understand. Shaq didn't demand respect through force or power. He commanded it through consistency, through showing up every day, through his actions. And Chris, though he hadn't fully realized it at the time, had underestimated that quiet strength. It was on a particularly busy evening, the kind where everything seemed to be happening at once, when Chris would find his next test. The restaurant had been fully booked for weeks, and the guests that night were a particularly demanding crowd: corporate executives, high-profile individuals, and a few celebrities scattered around the tables. The air in the restaurant was thick with anticipation, the staff working in harmony like a well-oiled machine, each movement practiced and precise. As Chris weaved through the maze of tables, juggling orders and refills, he could feel the pressure mounting. The energy in the room was electric, but it was also exhausting. The customers' expectations were high, and the slightest mistake could lead to a reprimand, a complaint, or worse, an irritated guest. Chris had handled pressure like this before, but this time it felt different. The cockiness that had once allowed him to breeze through the busiest shifts had evaporated. Instead, there was a careful attention to detail, a desire to get things right, not for his own pride, but because he genuinely wanted to ensure everyone was happy, that the experience was flawless. Around halfway through the evening, a problem arose. A large table near the back. A group of businessmen celebrating a deal had received their food but found it unsatisfactory. The steaks were undercooked, the wine wasn't served at the right temperature, and there was an issue with their dessert order. The guests were irritated, raising their voices, calling for attention. The head waiter rushed over, but Chris knew that this was his table, and this was his moment to either prove himself or fail miserably. He took a deep breath before heading to the table, mentally preparing himself for the confrontation ahead. In the past, he would have brushed it off, laughed it off, or even gotten defensive. But now, with Shaq's lessons echoing in his mind, he approached the situation with a calm determination. He greeted the table, apologized profusely for the issues with their orders, and promised to fix the situation immediately. As he listened to their complaints, Chris realized something fundamental. This wasn't about him. It wasn't about whether they liked him or respected him. It was about the experience they had come for, and the responsibility he had to ensure it was as perfect as possible. He couldn't control their reactions, but he could control his own response, and that made all the difference. He immediately went to the kitchen, relaying the guests' concerns to the chef. He stayed calm and focused, never raising his voice or panicking. The chef quickly fixed the issue with the steaks, and Chris made sure the wine was adjusted to the correct temperature. He also personally oversaw the dessert order, making sure it was exactly as the guests had requested. The entire time, Chris felt a strange sense of peace in the chaos. It was as if he finally understood the balance between efficiency and humility, between doing a job well and doing it with respect for those around him. When he returned to the table with the corrected orders, the guests were still frustrated, but they appreciated the attention to detail, the speed with which their problems had been addressed. One of the men at the table, who had been particularly vocal about his dissatisfaction, looked up at Chris with a more neutral expression now, nodding in approval. "Well," the man said, "I have to admit you handled this much better than I expected. Not bad." Chris smiled and thanked him, but there was no smugness in his expression. Instead, there was a quiet sense of satisfaction that came from knowing he had done the right thing. Not because it had been easy, but because it had been necessary. As he walked away, he noticed Shaq standing by the bar, watching him from a distance. The look in his eyes was one of quiet approval, a small nod acknowledging that Chris had handled the situation with grace. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. As the night went on, Chris found himself reflecting on the evening's events. He thought about how in the past he might have tried to avoid dealing with difficult situations, how he might have shied away from confrontation or used humor to deflect the tension. But tonight had been different. Tonight he had faced the problem head-on without fear, without ego. He had accepted responsibility, made things right, and treated the guests with the respect they deserved. And in that moment he felt like he had taken another step forward in his journey, not just as a waiter but as a person. The next day, as Chris prepared for his shift, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't the same person who had walked into the restaurant weeks ago, filled with arrogance and overconfidence. He had learned so much since then, not just about the restaurant business but about life itself. The lessons Shaq had imparted to him, about humility, respect, and responsibility, had become ingrained in his approach to everything he did. And while he still had a long way to go, he now understood that the road to growth wasn't a straight line. It was filled with twists and turns, moments of doubt and moments of triumph, but it was always moving forward. Shaq, ever the quiet observer, had given him the space to find his own way, but now it was clear that he had been waiting for this moment. The moment when Chris would truly begin to understand the importance of his work, of his role, not just in the restaurant but in the world around him. Chris didn't need to hear it from Shaq. He could feel it in the way things had shifted within himself. The arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced with something far more valuable: self-awareness. As the evening continued, Chris walked through the restaurant with a newfound confidence, not because he was perfect, but because he knew he was on the right path. The road ahead was still long, and there would be many more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, Chris felt like he was finally becoming the person he was meant to be. He wasn't just a waiter. He was someone who had learned to respect others, to respect himself, and most importantly, to understand the true meaning of success. The resolution. The day was unusually quiet at the restaurant, a rare lull between the busy lunch and dinner rush, and Chris found himself leaning against the counter in the back kitchen, waiting for the next wave of orders to come in. The hum of the refrigerator, the clatter of pans in the kitchen, and the distant chatter of waitstaff working their way through the early evening tasks filled the air. For once, Chris felt at ease, as if everything around him was in perfect balance. It had been weeks since he'd had a moment of peace like this, but now, after everything that had happened, he felt grounded in a way he hadn't before. He could feel the weight of his transformation, the quiet pride that came from knowing that the work he had put into bettering himself was finally paying off. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, he heard the soft, purposeful footsteps of someone approaching behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Shaq. Shaq's presence was a constant at the restaurant, his silent observation a hallmark of the lessons Chris had learned over the last few weeks. It was a quiet, unspoken mentorship that had shaped Chris in ways he had never expected. Shaq stopped beside him, leaning slightly against the counter. For a moment they both stood in silence, watching the restaurant as it hummed with activity. Chris had learned that this was often how Shaq operated: quiet, present, never rushing to fill the silence with unnecessary words. It was a style of leadership that spoke volumes without ever needing to speak. Finally, Shaq broke the silence, his voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. "You've come a long way, Chris. I've been watching." Chris didn't know how to respond at first. He wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not from someone like Shaq, whose expectations were higher than anything Chris had ever encountered. He had spent so much of his life seeking approval, and now, hearing Shaq's words, he realized how much he had changed. He wasn't looking for validation anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. For the first time, he was simply content. "I've been trying," Chris said, his voice low but sincere. "I didn't know what I was doing when I first started here, but I get it now. I get why this matters." Shaq nodded, his expression unreadable as always. "It's not just about making things right, Chris. It's about doing things the right way, consistently, every day. And that's something I think you've finally understood, not just in your work but in your life. The people around you can feel it too. You've earned their respect." Chris felt a weight lift from his chest at those words. He had earned their respect. It wasn't something he could buy or fake. It was something he had to work for. something he had to build through action, through understanding, and through humility. He had spent so much time trying to fit into a world that wasn't his, trying to prove that he belonged, but now he understood that belonging wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about being genuine, being authentic, and showing up with integrity. He had learned that lesson through hard work and sometimes painful self-reflection. Shaq continued, his tone shifting slightly, as if he were giving Chris the final piece of the puzzle. You know, this restaurant isn't just a business to me. It's a reflection of who I am, of everything I've worked for. I've built it from nothing, and I've spent years making sure that everything here reflects the values I believe in. Respect, honesty, hard work. It's about more than just serving food. It's about creating an experience, about treating every person who walks through those doors with the same level of care and dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. And you're part of that, Chris. You always have been. The words hit Chris like a wave, and he felt a deep sense of understanding wash over him. He wasn't just working in a restaurant. He was part of something much larger than himself, something that had been built with intention and purpose. And now, after everything he had learned, he was an integral part of that vision. He was no longer just a cog in the machine. He was contributing to something meaningful. Shaq gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. I think you're ready. Ready for more responsibility. Ready for more than just waiting tables. Chris's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what Shaq meant, but he could feel the weight of the moment. What do you mean? Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Chris could hear. I'm offering you a position to manage a team. You'll be in charge of the waitstaff, overseeing shifts, making sure things run smoothly. It's not going to be easy, but I think you've earned it. Chris's mind raced. He had spent so many years trying to avoid responsibility, trying to stay in the background, trying to make his job as easy as possible. But now, standing before Shaq, he realized that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. It was an opportunity to prove to himself that he could be more than what he had been, that he could rise to the challenge, that he could contribute in a way that was meaningful. I won't let you down, Chris said, his voice full of conviction. I know you won't, Shaq replied, his eyes meeting Chris's with the kind of quiet trust that only came from someone who had seen potential and believed in it, even when it wasn't obvious. From that moment on, Chris stepped into his new role with a sense of purpose that he had never felt before. He approached the job with a new level of respect for the work and for the people he worked with. He didn't take shortcuts, didn't try to cut corners. He did the work because it mattered, because the experience of the restaurant, the experience of every customer who walked through the door, was something worth preserving. Shaq's offer wasn't just a promotion, it was a test. It was a challenge to see if Chris could take everything he had learned and apply it in a meaningful way. And Chris, for the first time in his life, was ready to rise to that challenge. As he began to take on more responsibility, Chris found that the lessons he had learned in the past few months extended far beyond the walls of the restaurant. He began to understand how his actions affected others, how the energy he brought into a room could set the tone for everyone else. He became more attuned to the needs of his coworkers, more patient with difficult customers, and more willing to listen, to learn, and to grow. And with each day, he found that the more he gave, the more he received in return. Shaq's mentorship had not just been about making Chris a better waiter. It had been about making him a better person. It had been about teaching him how to lead with humility, how to embrace challenges, how to own his mistakes, and how to grow from them. It was about understanding that true success wasn't just about climbing the ladder. It was about the people you lifted up along the way. The restaurant became more than just a place of business. It became a symbol of Chris's transformation, a place where he had learned the true meaning of respect, hard work, and leadership. And as he stood there, managing his team and ensuring that every customer had the best experience possible, he realized that the journey he had started wasn't over. It had only just begun. Chris stood at the front of the restaurant, watching as the final few patrons of the night gathered their coats and left, their laughter and chatter fading into the quiet hum of the empty space. The restaurant had closed for the night, but the work was far from over. He still had a stack of reports to go through, a few last-minute adjustments to make to the schedule for tomorrow, and a final sweep of the floor to ensure everything was in its place. It was late and the exhaustion weighed on him, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came with knowing the day had been well spent. the kind that reminded him of how far he had come. As he moved through the restaurant, ensuring everything was locked up for the night, his thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the arrogant young man who had walked through these doors months ago, the man who had assumed he was above it all, who had thought he could navigate life with little more than charm and bravado. That man was gone now, replaced by someone different, someone who had learned the value of humility, the importance of hard work, and the strength that came from listening and learning. The journey had been tough, filled with mistakes, failures, and moments of doubt, but it had been worth it. Every moment of frustration, every challenge, every conversation with Shaq had taught him something invaluable. He had learned that success wasn't just about what you could achieve for yourself. It was about the impact you had on others, the way you treated the people around you, the respect you gave and received. It was about building something that lasted, something that wasn't defined by wealth or status, but by integrity and effort. As Chris finished the last of his tasks and stood in the empty dining room, he looked around one last time, taking in the familiar surroundings. This place wasn't just a job to him anymore. It had become part of who he was. It was where he had learned to become the person he had always hoped to be, where he had found a purpose, where he had grown, not just as an employee, but as a human being. He took a deep breath, the silence of the restaurant settling around him like a comforting blanket, and he felt a quiet satisfaction, a peace that came from knowing that he had truly earned his place here, not just because of the job, but because of the man he had become. The door to the office opened and Shaq stepped out, his presence as calm and steady as ever. Chris turned to face him, a sense of gratitude welling up inside him. Shaq didn't say much, didn't need to. His quiet nod of approval was all that was needed. "You've come a long way," Shaq said, his voice steady and sincere. Chris smiled, the weight of his journey finally lifting from his shoulders. "I know, and I'm not done yet." Shaq looked at him for a moment as if considering something. Then with a slight nod he turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Chris alone in the stillness of the night. But this time, it wasn't the same loneliness that had once plagued him. This time it was a sense of freedom, a feeling that the future was full of possibilities, and he was ready to face whatever came next. Chris took one last look around the restaurant, the place that had become more than just a job. It had become a testament to his growth, a reminder of everything he had learned and overcome. And as the door clicked shut behind him, the soft sound of footsteps fading into the night, he knew that this chapter of his life had ended, but the story was far from over. The end.